Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you. I know there may be some friends on this call, and I hope that all of you will have an opportunity to take away something today that you can put to use to make an impact in your community. It's great that Brady Ware and Company is committed to investing in nonprofits and takes seriously that board leadership is a huge part of nonprofit success. Very briefly, I love the opportunity to work for a living, to work with nonprofits and community boards. I serve on many boards, so I have to eat my own dog food and live it out each day. What we're going to talk about today, the three main topics. One is not to take for granted the importance of your board service. It's really important role. It's not something to take lightly, and you can have a great impact, but it's also a great responsibility. We're going to then look briefly at key board roles and how boards are doing to help you provide some context, and we'll be asking you to chime in on how well your board is doing. And then I'm going to walk you through a simple process of 4 key steps to take your board from where it is today to even higher performing. And finally, we're going to end with some Q&A. Melissa, Missy, and I will address your questions at the end. Kara already gave some housekeeping, but please be ready. I'm going to ask each of you at the end, too, to put into the chat what one commitment that you may make from this workshop today that you can take back and put to work. And you will get a copy of these slides afterwards. So first, the importance of board service. Board, as much as we love our nonprofit CEOs and leaders, the boards are what helps our nonprofits to endure and sustain themselves over decades. And we know some nonprofits are several hundred years old. The foundation of so many of our institutions in America come from nonprofits, whether they be universities, hospitals, the nursing profession, and many others. So your work is really important. What does it give you as you do it well and you engage in it and you recommit to it? You get connections to a network. You have the opportunity to learn when you challenge yourself to roll up your sleeves and get engaged and to even tackle difficult challenges within your board or within your nonprofit. The leadership development opportunities, as I work with several corporations to put their leaders onto nonprofit boards, they see the benefit, and then an opportunity to impact your lives. So it's important to keep these motivations in mind, as after all, you are a volunteer and you have to refuel yourself as you commit to this work. So governance matters, and it's challenging. The nonprofits and boards, as you know, even corporations had to pivot during the pandemic to a new way of working and handling the uncertainty of income, putting events on hold and figuring out how to do virtual events. There's competition for talent, even more so in nonprofits, as it's challenging to compete in the first place without having the financial and other rewards. So that's a challenge. There's an expectation and an opportunity to continue to advance our DE&I, and there's also, of course, inflation and economic worries. This is a model that it may look kind of complicated, but what I want to share with you is that the role of a board can be challenging to understand, but at the end of the day, the CEO in the middle of the slide on the left is the linchpin between the board and the staff. The board is a partner with the CEO in partnering on essentially governance and mission impact, strategy, funding, policy, and the CEO is the one responsible for the staff. So there is a clear line of responsibility, day-to-day responsibility for staff, and operations and implementation is in the CEO's hand, but the board has a critical role in the mission impact, working hand in hand with the CEO and the staff to set the strategy and to ultimately be responsible for the mission impact. That's the 501c3 status that you get as a nonprofit, and you have those legal responsibilities. How are boards doing? You can see all of you, many of you, most of you probably on this call are used to getting A's, maybe a few B's, but mostly A's. the reason we work on boards is because it does take intention to optimize the way that we work as a board. Coming together infrequently as volunteers to do important work requires some intention. And that's why we invest in board development. That's why we take the time to do these kind of webinars. That's why we recommend that Board Source and others recommend that every couple of years you do a board self-assessment and say, how are we doing and where are we going as a board and how can we better organize ourselves? We do okay on mission because we have passion for mission, and that's the reason a lot of times we come to the board's work. We particularly struggle in the area of building our own board. It's competition for talent on the board, competition for individuals who are willing to lead is a challenge, and also fundraising. Fundraising is intimidating to a lot of board members, and it's really a team sport between a CEO, their development team, the staff, and the board doing it together. And just like in for-profit fundraising and sales, not every board member has the same gifts or talents, so it needs to be customized for the individual board member, many ways that you can contribute. Now I'm going to stop a minute, and Kara is going to run a poll for us. I would like to ask each of you to step back and reflect. How do you evaluate your board's overall performance? A is, I would call excellent or outstanding. B is good. C is, let's call it okay or moderate. So if you can just take a moment, I would appreciate if you can give us this answer and see how we're doing as a group. Okay. Wow, we have a few tough graders out there. So it looks like everybody but even the 3 organizations, you can always improve, but it looks like all of us agree that there's opportunities to go from okay, moderate, and even good to great. So that's why you're here today, and I look forward to asking you later how you're going to work on that together. Okay. You can feel free to put some of your response in the chat. As you gave yourself a score for a board, there was probably 1 or 2 or a handful of things that were on your mind for why you think the board performance is not where it needs to be. Common things like just people being busy and such. So feel free to comment, but I'm going to go through what some of the typical challenges to a board in terms of performance look like, so that we can be aware as we work on this together that these issues are common, yet nonetheless, there are some very outstanding boards, and many of the best nonprofits do have those outstanding boards. So we can keep working on this. One is role confusion and complexity. There are a number of responsibilities of a board, and how do we break those down in such a way through officer roles, committee chairs, and good agendas so that we can put that role to work. Time and lack of leadership. Leadership in particular, the few handful of leaders on a board are critical to setting an agenda and creating an environment of engaging others and structuring the work. And so it's really critically important to have good leadership. Value and meaning. Are we coming to board meetings where there's some meat and potatoes on the table, or is it just a bunch of reporting? How well are our agendas providing that sense of meeting? Are we working on refreshing and developing the board? Do we have the same people? Are we doing the same things, or are we working on getting a game plan for our board for how we can make a difference? We may not be evolving and changing. Organizations, just like businesses, go through different stages of change, and it's an intentional process. And finally, simply, are we being intentional about what a good board looks like for us and what this current board needs to contribute to the organization? Just like a recruiting process is for an employee, same thing for board development. We have a circular process of having to engage. We want to identify and cultivate what kind of board and board members and composition, size, et cetera, we need to have for our organization. Then we need to strategically recruit and slate officers and leaders in the right place to put that talent together. We need to orient, involve, and educate evaluate, and that's part of what we're talking about today. Your participation is process of helping to evaluate, and then we need to rotate, and we need to continually invest in engaging our board, not just as a whole, but individuals within those boards. So if you're a board leader, that engagement and that process of talent management and talent identification and individually harnessing that talent, or if you're a committee leader, that is your responsibility, like it is in any kind of setting where you're a leader. So now we're going to shift to how do we go from okay, moderate, toward great? How do we pursue steps to a better board? The 4 key steps, and this comes from one of my colleagues that I worked with at Georgia Center for Nonprofits when I was running the consulting there and working on governing. It is a process, as we discussed earlier, of being intentional. One is, yes, there's lots of responsibilities of a board, but it's also like a good team, finding your right focus. Second, once you find your focus, how do we structure to put that to work? And oftentimes we may be lacking talent. We need to marshal more talent, or we need to motivate individuals within the board who have been untapped for their talent because there hasn't been the right focus or the right structure. And we also need to build good, strong working relationships among our board members, board leaders, and then with our CEO and any of the staff liaisons that partner with our board to do the work. So first, step 1, finding your focus. A key question that all boards need to ask themselves is why are we here? What does success look like for this organization and this board? That's one of the most fundamental questions that a board can ask. Secondly, how does this board need to focus given the current context of the organization? There are situations, that's why we do periodic strategic planning and situation analysis that do lead to helping you develop that focus. Also, how do we hold ourselves accountable? We all know that the best organizations strive for achievement, and part of that comes with both freedom, but also accountabilities. What are some examples of a focus? These are some examples of one key focus. Boards don't usually have the luxury just to have one, but usually there's one that can pull the team together that's really critical. An example would be, and many nonprofits are run by founders. There's a baby boomer generation that is continuing to retire right now. Even if they're not at retirement age, a lot of times they need to move on as founders. So an example would be you have a founding or a longtime ED that's retiring. That is a point of great opportunity and also vulnerability for a nonprofit, as nonprofits don't typically have as deep of a bench and frequently don't have an internal successor that's ready to step in. So an example of the board focus would be that the board has to work on succession planning, including, usually this means that they need to step up in the transition. Frequently, founder-led organizations do have strong leaders, and sometimes the board is not as strongly partnered with the founder in driving the strategy in the organization. So it's a combination of succession and frequently board development and board maturation that takes place during these periods. Another example is when you have financial challenges. I'm working with a CEO right now as a coach whose organization has been running a deficit for many years. This is a new leader, and she needs to partner to try to figure out how to run the budget in the black. And so that's a partnering effort. The board has to step in to look at mission versus money and be willing to partner with that CEO to say, we can't hold on to things that when they lose money, or if we do, we need to figure out how to step up and step up our financial giving in order to keep this program or this activity. Dashboard. I talked earlier about accountability. How is our board, in terms of our focus, having a dashboard that looks at things like how are we accountable to our engagement? Meeting attendance may sound simple, but it's important. If you have people kind of taking for granted the basic work of working together, then and you have people coming and going, and some people never showing up, and can be quite discouraging and can have kind of a slow impact on demotivating the board to participate. So your board meeting attendance, your committee meeting participation, your individual member attendance, looking at these things, but also what is your dashboard of the handful of, at the bottom, and these slides will be made available to you, the handful of strategic goals that the organization's working on, and usually the board has some role. Also, some organizations, not all, they not only set a goal of the best practice is for 100% giving among board members. Individuals on the board should all give a gift from their own personal pocket, and foundations look for that. But sometimes boards set a goal for the board as a whole, and sometimes they have a challenge gift within that goal. This is especially useful if the organization really does need to raise funds, and it's tied to, it's particularly motivating to boards if it's tied to some strategies and some impacts that you've been part of developing. Okay, step one was focus. Now step two. Now that we have our focus, let's look back at our structure and how that structure can support us putting this focus to work. We need to go back and revisit our leadership roles and responsibilities as a whole, and refocus on what those look like. If we haven't had active committees, this may be the time to revisit those and to look at their charter. And it may, for example, if you're doing succession, mean that you need to put a task force together, a transition task force or succession task force. Looking back at the composition, the decision authority, and how you're going to work together to make those committees collaborate for success. And then you need to match talent to roles. And if you have gaps of the talent, that leads to identification of strategic recruitment opportunities. I've worked with nonprofits who have not had a successor chair or vice chair, and sometimes had to go out and recruit for a chair. It doesn't mean that they always go straight into chair. Sometimes they go into a vice chair role, and you convince the chair to spend one more year. But that strategic recruitment is quite important sometimes too. And then where does the rubber meet the road of focus then tying to that structure? It's when the committees or the task forces also identify one or more goals that they're going to work together to implement, and some accountability there. So aspects of structuring for success. Generally, I recommend that you have 3 to 5 committees for an average of a 12 to 18 person board. Of course, boards can vary in their size and composition. There are some giant boards, particularly for large institutions like junior achievement or museums and such. But frequently, if that's the case, they have an executive board that is more like the 12 to 18 person board. I also think really a powerful aspect of board development on an ongoing basis, especially in this step 1, 2, 3, 4 process, is if you don't have a governance committee, and I would recommend you can keep it governance. I like the word board development because it implies an active process, an ongoing process, and governance can sometimes be considered just policy. You create a board development committee whose work is to come alongside the officers and regularly pay attention to the board and how it's functioning, and to support things like orientation, strategic recruitment, and such. Other common committees include finance, development, fundraising, and executive. And if you do have executive, which is a frequent committee, be careful that the executive committee doesn't do the work of the board. That all that work should, one, you should invite committee chairs to those executive meetings, and 2, the executive committee should not make decisions of the board. If they make emergency decisions, those should be brought to the board for vote. And any of the work of the executive committee should be transparent to the full board. Nonetheless, executive committee can be quite powerful in coming together more regularly to provide coaching support and to move things along and to plan powerful agendas. Common task forces could include succession or transition, capital campaign, or strategic planning. After you develop a plan, find a structure. Sometimes you need to, on an ongoing basis, you need to continue to marshal more talent. If you recall earlier to how the boards are doing, board composition and recruiting was one of the lowest areas of success. There's competition for talent, and it takes effort to go outside of your own just immediate network to say, what do we need? What's the composition? What's the talent? What's the diversity? And is somebody also willing and able to lead and not just show up? So it's important to ideally always have kind of a leader pipeline. Sometimes you can do that by having committee members that are non-board members. The way that your organization engages its volunteers, and if it doesn't have volunteers, that can be quite helpful to develop a pipeline. Your corporate relationships and partnerships out there, you should always be looking for talent and even partnering with your staff and helping you look for talent. You should consider, again, reassessing your board size and composition using a matrix. What do we know about the current demographics of our board in terms of their age, their skill, their talent, their race, and other composition, so that we can find what the gaps need to be. You always need people with certain skills and talents, but you also need some people with time and willingness to lead. So don't forget those aspects of who you're going out to recruit. And then ultimately having a strategic board nominations to recruit for that profile of who you're targeting. And it's not just that board nominations committee, it's everybody, but that committee is particularly developing the recruitment plan. And it is a recruitment plan. It's not just grab the first person that Bob or Joe or Sally knows. It should be strategic. Once you find those members, you should orient them to the organization, the people. This is a bit harder in COVID times when boards are meeting. A lot of times they're meeting infrequently. They're meeting online. It really is imperative and important that your board members do get an opportunity to see the mission, to touch the mission. So to the extent that you can bring that mission to them, and make sure you do have some in-person meetings for those connections to the mission and to each other. That's really important. Assigning new members to best meet the organizational needs, asking them what their preferences are, providing mentorship, and helping those new members find a place to contribute. And then, the volunteer management is recognize and reward and hold volunteers accountable. It's all those things that you do with staff. The difference is they're unpaid, but nonetheless, when we all know that when we take something seriously and when we know that we're needed and there are expectations, we rise to the occasion more likely. Finally, step 4, building working relationships. We need to build a common understanding of the board and CEO role, including some lines of authority, mechanisms for building trust and collaboration in areas of co-leadership. This can sometimes be challenging, and it can be challenging for a lot of reasons, including just in general, partnering and relationship building and control are common challenges of humans working together, whether it be in our home or our workplace. The chair of the organization is a really important relationship to also have that relationship to the CEO, where it's support and accountability. So it's important that if you as a nominations committee are involved in that process of trying to motivate and select a chair, that the CEO also has a role in that, because that chair needs to partner well with the CEO. Sometimes board chairs and CEOs meet as often as weekly, and that's just an important relationship. And if it's broken, it can really create a challenge for the board to work well as a whole. It's also important to invest to build productive relationships between the board and the staff leadership. I hope that you can appreciate how hard the staff work and are eager to learn more about who's on the team, and to encourage your CEO to not only help you get oriented with that, but to make some connections to some of those staff leaders. some staff CEOs regularly bring their executive team or regularly bring guests to their board meetings. That's not necessary, but it can be helpful. So if you feel like you do need to get to know people, don't be shy about visiting the office or asking for opportunities to connect, or even hearing some of the expertise at one of your board meetings from somebody in fundraising or somebody in program. It's important that it's not just you and the CEO, but the staff as a whole. The other relationship is that it's important that the board, this is the best practice, some boards avoid it, but you're there as a board to both support, hire, and also hold accountable the executive director to accomplishing the goals that you're setting out, and to the board, the job description of the CEO. It's important that you agree to the mutual performance expectations and to the process of a review, but that's something that is an important tool. The best CEOs and boards do find that to be a very helpful, healthy process. We all like feedback, and we certainly also don't want to find ourselves in a situation where performance is dragging and we're not willing to take action if there's an opportunity to improve or to have to make a change. That's one of the hardest steps a board would have to do, is to take to give a poor performance review, but it's also a responsibility to the CEO to be able to adjust and work on those areas of strength as well as areas of weakness, sometimes getting a coach for them. So that's an important best practice in building that working relationship. It's also important that you invest in developing clarity around key decisions so that you don't micromanage, and that you also don't abdicate responsibility. So, day-to-day hiring of a staff and day-to-day spending within the budget is clearly in the domain of a CEO. But that doesn't mean that you can't have input to important spending decisions or important hires, especially if it's a brand new hire that's adding to your budget, or a C-level hire. Just like in a good organization, understanding who's the decision maker, who's a recommender, and who gives input to this process. So if you, as a board, don't feel like you're getting adequate input, then it's okay to look at key areas of decision making and to try to clarify that. It's also important to discuss expectations. This happens frequently with the chair, especially, and to if there are role issues, to do role clarification. That's just a healthy process between a board and a CEO. Some founder board members really want to minimize the role that the board has, and so that's really important to address, because a board ultimately should have co-leadership, and that won't happen unless you have those very clear, honest discussions. Other CEOs will expect a lot from their board, and it's important that the board clarifies what they need and what they can contribute. So it goes both ways. They're also, the board members should, just like the CEO, be willing to be assessed. So if a CEO is going to be assessed for their contribution against their job description, as well as their role in accomplishing the goals of the organization, board members should also look at doing their own periodic review, and the CEO should be invited to give feedback in that review. So essentially, it's important to create an environment to encourage honest, constructive communication. So that's what you want. Is we don't want to be stepping on toes, but we also don't want to be stepping on eggshells. We need to be able to have constructive, honest, respectful conversations to address concerns or to clarify, like you do in any good working relationship. There's also something called, comes from my colleague, Neil, who was a psychologist. I love it. It's just this zone of accommodation. So it's not perfect. It's not perfect always what the CEO versus the board's role is. that you need to provide some space for adaptation and compromise when questions arise. So be flexible, try to work it out, but also be flexible. On another note, board members, on the one hand, shouldn't come in and feel like they have the idea of the day that the CEO should immediately act on. But it is important that board members can have what I would call constructive meddling, that it's important that the board can have an understanding of the organization and takes the time to do that. I just got done with a strategic planning process with one of the boards that I sit on, and there was some gap between the board's understanding of the capacity of the organization and what the opportunity ahead for them was versus the nonprofit that I sit on, which is just a two-person organization and essentially is doing great, but they're still at a stage of development where there's a big gap between where some board members' aspirations are immediately and where the organization is. How can you get that understanding? You can do it through some SWOT analysis, but there's no substitute for going and visiting and putting yourself in the shoes of the nonprofit itself, seeing what it takes to run the operation, to spend time with the CEO, to know what all the different multitude of things that they're doing every day and asking questions. Finally, attending to the process. How are we keeping people informed? How are meetings conducted? How are we doing this work? What's our process for planning good agendas, planning how we go about developing our budgets, setting goals? The how is important along with the what. So now I'm going to ask each of you to spend some time reflecting on this. We talked about focus, structure. We talked about the working relationships and marshaling talent. What is one step that you want to be accountable for from this workshop that you will take back to your board leadership, to your board role, to try to move your organization from where it is today to the next step? So I'm going to pause and give time for each of you to write that in the chat, and I'm going to take a look at some of those chats. Lead, don't just show up. Better define roles and expectations. Evaluate the skills and recruit new members. Thank you. Keep them coming. A better board selection matrix. A lot of comments around the talent and the gaps and need for leadership. Communicate needs, roles, and improve recruitment. Board member job descriptions and expectations. It sounds like, one of the things that happens with nonprofit leadership sometimes and volunteer roles is we come to it, and sometimes we're either shy of speaking up because we're with our fellow volunteers, or sometimes we come to it just thinking we can just make a difference by showing up. And yes, you do make a difference by showing up. But again, going back to the important role of a board, this is a big responsibility. And so some of you may need to assess whether or not you have the time and the energy to do this work on a board level, because there are other ways that you can serve with some hands-on volunteering, but it is a big responsibility. At the same time, it's a great reward. When I work with board members and help them self-assess, and I ask them, why do you come to board meetings? Why do you engage? They put their hand up because they say, because I know that I'm particularly needed, that I am making a difference. And so reminding ourselves that sometimes we are just taking for granted. Yes, not everybody's going to always meet our expectations. There are going to always be the 20 to 40% of board members that do the majority of the work, the leadership. But that doesn't mean that not everybody on that board can find one way to contribute meaningfully, and two, that we can't ask for more, because when people step up and are challenged, that's when they also find the most reward. So I'm going to give 1 or 2 more minutes. It sounds like a big theme here is some basic, simple, setting some expectations, having some accountability, and making sure you do have some of the right people for your board. So I look forward to hearing how that goes. Well, thank you everybody for your participation today. What I'm going to share with you is many of you did talk about trying to work on a board, and this is not a this is not a board matrix, but I certainly can provide a example of a matrix to you. But I want to pull up, if this works, this is the leave behind that I would encourage you to do as a simple step with your board, is to do a simple board assessment. And this is designed around the four key practices of finding your focus, board leadership expectations, as well as strategic board recruitment. So this is going to be a resource that I would encourage any of you that, especially if you gave yourself a 2 or 3, take just a few minutes yourself and maybe bring to your board leadership the opportunity to just do a simple self-assessment. There's longer ones, but get started somewhere and agree that you either need to go and do something more comprehensive with a full online Survey Monkey with comments, and what's the best thing about this board? What do we really need to work on? What should our focus be? You can add to this, but if nothing else, think about getting a handful of you on board to say, yeah, I agree that we could do better. Just like you gave yourself a 2 or 3 today, and how can we move forward to do that together? So that's a recommendation. I also put an example of a board covenant in this resources file with basically how can we ask our board to be committed toward our roles and responsibilities. It is a best practice that not only do you have a good board job description that identifies that, but some of the best boards not only have a board job description, but they ask their board members to sign kind of a board responsibility covenant. Even if it's just a simple 1-pager that says, I will commit to these roles and responsibilities. I will commit to showing up, attendance. I will commit to my give and or get. I will commit to serving actively on a committee. I will commit to joining, to visiting the program, and to be part of key events as part of my ambassador role, things like that. Even if it's a simple 1-pager, some organizations have more details where they do things like, how am I going to do my give and or get? Am I going to host a party at my house? Am I going to help connect this organization to these 3 corporations? So that's the tool that I have here. 12 principles of exceptional boards in terms of the culture of your board and how you are able to build those healthy relationships. And then there's the preeminent resource that looks at board best practices and how boards are doing is Board Source. And there's a whole study on leading with intent that I've pointed you to. There's also a strategy I would encourage you to do at 1 or more of your board meetings. It's a simple 6 Sigma process. Some of you might be familiar with 6 Sigma, but one practice that you can put into place, and maybe as a start, in addition to this board self-assessment, is just to say, what is working within this board at the end of each board meeting? What is a plus? What is a positive from how we're working together as a board, or from how we're doing this work together, and even from this board meeting? And then the delta part of that 6 Sigma process is, what can we change? What could be improved? I know it sounds simple. Some organizations do board meeting reviews at the end of each board meeting. If you want to do that, that's great. But a simple process is just to start somewhere by asking what's working well, what could be improved. So thank you for your participation today, for investing. You're already above the line of great board members by investing in yourself and investing in this process. I encourage you to take this beyond yourself to the rest of your board. If you're a CEO, to bring it to your board. You will have these materials. And I'm happy to also, if there's something that you're missing, something that you would like to get an example from me or have a follow-up conversation, this is how you can reach me. So we're going to move now into Q&A, and Missy's going to help read some of the questions, and we'll address your questions that are on the top of your mind right now.
Well, thank you so much for that presentation. That was absolutely fabulous. And I have like 1,000 questions, so I'm going to start off before everyone starts getting theirs in there. You know, I was a board chair of a very small organization, and it was a working board. And so there were a lot of expectations that we had. And we even had a form. Part of me and the executive director would sit down with people, and this is what we expect. This is what we need. We need you to be a working board. You must be on a committee. And then time and time again, I would get people, after signing the agreement, they would do this, and they would do nothing. They would barely show up to meetings, not sit on in committees. And me and the executive director were like, did we not go over this? And you know, we couldn't afford to have people that weren't going to participate. So what do you do in those situations? I mean, we felt like we vetted, and then having that awkward conversation of, you're not stepping up. It just is horrible.
Well, it is hard. I mean, I think on the front end, you do your best to communicate those expectations and to even almost talk people out of it. I mean, to even give them a sense of, I mean, this is the average board member puts in somewhere between 4 to 6 plus hours a month. A board chair puts in 8 to 10 plus hours a month. So the more that you can, you know, communicate what's needed and that it is a responsibility, and, you know, and not just sort of take anybody you can get. So on the front end, and then to the extent that they've already proven themselves, obviously, or they have a track record of leadership at another board. I mean, just like anything else, if the more that the recruit has shown up and delivered to other organizations, or shown up and delivered to your organizations, the better odds that they will. And then, you know, you do your best to individualize the way that you reach out to them and get them started. I mean, to the extent that you can mentor them to get them started to some success. Sometimes people want to do it, but they don't know how, and they're shy about asking. We don't have a lot of supports for our board members. We might think they know how to do fundraising. They're intimidated by it. They think it needs to be cold calling, when there's lots of different ways. They can write a thank you note. They can make a phone call. So I think there's training, there's support, and then there's mentorship. And then how can we get somebody, you know, what is some low hanging fruit that we can do? You know, a board chair of working with, and it shouldn't just be the board chair, the extent that you have the chair plus your board development committee supporting those individual board members and helping them get success, the staff helping them get success. And then at the end of the day, they're going to be people that let you down. I mean, the best that you can do sometimes is check in with them. It is important to some people do have life get in the way. They have seniors that they're taking care of that were unanticipated. You know, COVID threw a lot of people for a loop in terms of childcare and taking care of seniors. So I think that the expectation generally is that you won't have everybody 100% be highly engaged, a working board. So you're going to so try to prioritize the people in the right areas where you most need the board's work. And then ultimately the board has to challenge itself, is this sustainable, or do we really need to be about raising some more money and hiring a staff?
Right. Great. Thank you.
Great advice. There has to be some grace.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay. We do have some questions here other than mine. First one is, what are some suggestions of places to look for board members? So that,
sure.
How do you go find them? Yeah.
Sure. Well, a couple things. One is there are service clubs. There are leadership organizations. Not all cities have those, but sometimes those people are taxed already. So that's the downside of them. there are corporations who, especially in Atlanta, and I don't know as much in small cities, but HR and or community people, or even C-levels within corporations, can sometimes be a resource to say, hey, we're looking for board talent, and we're particularly looking for this kind of skill set and or this kind of diversity. And they will help you. Not all, but some corporations do really value getting their leaders engaged. Certainly law firms, accounting firms, most always value that, because there's also business networking and professional development that takes place. But, you know, here in Atlanta, for example, I know many of the charitable companies have somebody charged with trying to vet community ask. And so I'm doing strategic board recruiting as a support for a couple nonprofits, and I know who some of those people are. So also, like, you know, your community foundation, your United Ways, your places that know the network of leaders, your funders. Your funders, you know, they like to not only give money, they like to give advice. I worked with a board once that did not have its next chair. And I really challenged the CEO to say, go to your key funders and say, we need real good board leadership. Where, you know, what ideas do you have? And they were able to recruit the former chair of the Atlanta Women's Foundation. I mean, when you go to that level of ask, to the preeminent foundation in town, they know who those talented board leaders are. And so, you know, there's a small circle of leaders who know leaders. Sometimes you can even go to your competitive nonprofits or nonprofits in your space and say, hey, do you have anybody rolling off? You know, and, you know, partner with, it should be the board, but also sometimes the CEO networking to talent.
Great. Awesome. Great advice. Next question. How do I, as a board president, handle working full-time and being the board president? We have a working board.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, you just do your best. You know, you do your best to, it's sort of the Stephen Covey, you know, importance, performance, you know, what's important, how do you prioritize, and managing your own expectations. At the end of the day, you've been willing to say yes to being president. It probably could help you to just set some expectations of where you can make a difference, and to manage within those, and partner with your CEO on that, and then to see if you can have other board leaders step up. Sometimes the president carries undue weight, and sometimes they do it to themselves because they're such a responsible, committed person that other people don't even feel like their time and talent is needed. So I would say evaluate the rest of your team, the rest of your leadership, see if you can build, just like a good CEO would try to build a management team for shared responsibilities, evaluate who else can step up with you, and then find your focus, and try to give yourself the permission to say, this is my primary aim as a president is to help the organization do this or that, and then try to do this or that well, and see how you can marshal more talent with challenging and encouraging and supporting others to step up with you.
Great advice. Always hard to challenge to juggle that. Next question. How do you balance having board members who have influence and not enough time versus board members who will invest in the org and be dedicated? So you got people at different levels and different time.
Sure. Yeah. Well, sometimes you can have an advisory or a trustee commit, like you can have honorary chairs or trustees or advisory groups there's different ways you can do advisory groups. Sometimes you can do it like a medical one that's a set of experts, but you can also have really busy, influential CEO types that you can put on an advisory group, and they can just open up a door, or they can host an event. And so sometimes you can have people at that level where you're engaging them, you know, once or twice a year and for something powerful. And if they can't really show up the meetings, they can't do the basic duties of the job, it's not generally recommended you put them on the board. I mean, usually those really, really busy, influential people can best be on like a quarterly board, you know, one that's really kind of got a full staff and they can come and create a lot of leverage, and not necessarily a working board. How can they be a donor? How can they be an advisor? Or you have to consider, is there a way that they can do, if we're meeting monthly, they're probably not going to be able to show up to monthly meetings. So you might need to think about, do we really need to meet monthly, or can we meet quarterly, and they're on a finance committee and they're such a whiz bang at that, they can do a once a quarter. They can fulfill, a quarterly board meeting and a once a quarter finance meeting and create a lot of leverage, or they can be on the fundraising team and create a lot of leverage there. What's a way that we can leverage their contribution while finding the working board that runs the event, or is the quasi marketing person? You just really have to think carefully about the expectations, the structure that's needed, and how else could we engage that person if they're really not able to show up.
Right. Find a way to fit them in.
It can discourage people if you just have these big wigs on their board, but they can, and they ultimately want to fulfill their commitments too.
Right. Absolutely. Great advice. Okay, next question. If you already have an existing strong board, it could be intimidating to bring on less experienced board members, typically younger, but great talent. Any advice on how to mingle those together and make those new folks not feel so intimidated?
Yeah, well, one thing that I like to do is sometimes have existing and new board members kind of ask each other questions, and sort of have back and forth. What advice would you give to me as a new board member? And a lot of times the experienced board members see the good questions that the new ones have and see how they're bringing fresh new thinking in. So I think one is, you do probably need to, evaluate your expectations in terms of give and/or give, and make sure that they're reasonable for younger people. If people are writing $10,000 checks and they're just not there yet, what's the way that they can be successful? I think there needs to be a way that there's mentorship and an appreciation of multiple generations. And just like there is within a staff, we have multiple generations, talents, and hopefully when that young person's being brought on board, hopefully when every board member's brought on board, there's a sense of why they're uniquely being brought. They're being brought because they have a fresh perspective. Sometimes you bring somebody on that, sometimes nonprofits bring somebody on that was a former client, or somebody who was a first generation student, because it's serving first generation students, and they really have invaluable experience, personal experience to give. So hopefully everybody you bring onto the board, there's a kind of an affirmation of what that they're going to uniquely bring, and a way that they're tapped for that experience. Not that they're put into a box and said, well, you're only going to be able to speak about your first generation experience. But typically that person might be involved in giving advice to the CEO as they're, or they may be particularly tapped as you're looking at evolving your program. And how is this program really working at the ground level well for our first generation students? If we're having recruitment problems, how can we better recruit? And so that's the key, is everybody who's brought on the board should be brought on for reasons. If you want a young professional board because you want youth and you want them to develop into a board, that you can also have that, or you can have committee members that can demonstrate their value and their commitment. You can have a fundraising committee or some other committee where you get some diversity of age and or skill, and you can see how they perform, and they can get some sense of achievement before going straight on the board. There's lots of different strategies.
Yeah. Great advice. Next question. How can you engage board members in helping with tasks without forming the outside perception of an employer-employee relationship with a volunteer? We can't allow a volunteer at any level to have the perception of being able to commit the organization to a contractual relationship. So you got a board, you're asking them a lot, but then trying to limit what they can do, right?
Yeah, well, you have to have policies and practices in place for, training, policies and practices for media, who is able to speak to the media, practices around confidentiality of your board meetings, and what, how do you put organization first. The organizations should always be put first. So there's trainings and the financial policies that, and processes that they're aware of, that everything, that any check size, any contract should have to go through this process. And so you have to put those processes and policies in place and make your board members aware of that. Ultimately, if you get kind of a rogue person, you have to immediately clamp down on that and respectfully say, you're getting ahead of us.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's just like really enthusiasm, like, hey, I really think that there's this great opportunity to pursue this partnership or something. And remind people that at the end of the day, the staff are the ones that have to make these things work.
Right.
So our role as a board is primarily to come alongside as a partner.
Yeah.
Really, our decision-making authority really comes as a board on things like policies and practices, with CEOs also getting on board with that. The rest of all of what we do is largely partnering. So a partnering can't be one way. It has to be, you are, by nature in a nonprofit, one of the things that frustrates business leaders sometimes, especially if they come from a buttoned up company where decisions happen quickly, and especially if it's like top-down structures, is the nature of this collaborative model.
Yeah.
And so sometimes it can be frustrating to kind of entrepreneurial CEOs, take charge kind of people. And so that is also even part of your training, is like, and your ability to articulate what your culture is and how it works as part of your onboarding is critical.
Yeah. Awesome. Okay, this will be our last question, and
Okay.
I can't imagine that everybody doesn't have the same one, because we do have a working board and are very supportive. They show up for meetings, but not very involved in fundraising. Is that okay? I've seen the same exact problem, struggled with it myself. You have that expectation. So how do you leverage that in the board? Yeah.
Well, the rule of a board member is it's your time, talent, and your treasure.
Yeah.
But I do think working board members a lot of times feel like they're putting in so much. I think it just comes down to, what does the organization need? And if the CEO or the executive director or the staff are not expecting the board members, it doesn't just happen. Board members are not naturally fundraisers. Most people aren't. There's a few people out there that are salespeople and business developers, but usually you might have one or two of those on a board at most. And so if that's not happening from the CEO, that's not an expectation, then it can work. It can work. But on the other hand, if you want to have that nonprofit, if the board wants to have that nonprofit, the CEO wants to have that nonprofit continue to grow and advance, then those resources that board members bring are what we call gold, because they're non-restricted.
Right.
Many of the dollars that flow to nonprofits are what we call restricted dollars. They can only be used for X or Y. Also, if your nonprofit is, whether it's you or your development professional or your executive director, if they're asking other people for money, the expectation, the best practice is that the board members are also role modeling that by saying, I'm giving my time, my talent, and my money. It doesn't have to be large, but it is a best practice that there's 100% giving. Now, does that just happen overnight? No, it happens because we actually know that board members have to have training. Do we know what the elevator pitch is? What are board members most comfortable doing? They're most comfortable sharing a story, inviting somebody to an event, especially if it's kind of a fun event. They're not comfortable making a phone call, making a cold call. So what are the strategies that we can use, including I'm on a board where we're doing a teach-a-thon for kids that are underprivileged, that they get to have tennis lessons and after-school program. And the teach-a-thon is encouraging professionals to donate lessons. But as board members, they encouraged us to set up an individual page. And so I set up an individual page. I made my own contribution. I reached my friends and family. sometimes people are willing to ask their friends and family, right?
Right.
So using Facebook and social media, walks are popular. Almost everybody can figure out a way to come out and do a walk or a run. And those can tax the organization, but
Yeah.
it doesn't just happen. The nonprofit has to partner with the board to say, are we going to do some friend raising? Like where we just, let's start by, if we don't really have people that are familiar with our organization, we got to start by cultivating a community that cares about our work. If you tend to be funded by public dollars, organizations tend to get really lazy on philanthropic strategies.
Yeah.
So there's a great article called Philanthropy is a Team Sport.
Mm-hmm.
You really have to create a culture of philanthropy, and that's a system. And board members can't just jump into that system without there being a system that's existing and mechanisms, materials, stories, events, even like someone coming alongside them and role modeling and showing them how to do it. And then ultimately you have to have some accountability, and you have to be realistic on what your current board is able to contribute. So if you haven't set a give and or get, that's an important discussion that the governance or board committee could say, okay, do we need money? Why do we need this? Do we agree? You might have one or two board members that decide they have to roll off.
Yeah.
That's not a bad thing.
Right. Awesome. Well, thank everyone, first of all, for their questions and for, showing up. And Cindy, I mean, thank you for your time and your talent, and you are a treasure. So a great information that you shared with us, and I'll let you close with a few words if you'd like.
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, thank you. It's my greatest pleasure to work with volunteers. I know how challenging it can be to fit it into your life. At the same time, I also know how rewarding it can be. So again, you guys are already, by showing up today and committing to this, already above average and going to great. So I would encourage you just to not overwhelm yourself. Take one step and see where that might take you. Try to marshal some others that want to come alongside you. Don't be alone in this effort to say, I think we can do better. And then give yourself grace to say, I think this is where I can contribute. And if you feel like you need something from the organization or the board, ask for it. A good proactive employee also asks for what training and or supports they need. So it goes both ways. So thank you for your time. Thank you, Brady Ware and company, for your investment in the nonprofit community and sponsoring this workshop. It's been a pleasure. I look forward to hearing how things go.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and we'll see you again in the fall for our next one.
All right.